Modern people are accustomed to absolute domestic comfort. Your bathroom is surely sparkling clean and smells fresh. But historical reality presented a completely different picture of everyday life. A routine trip to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was a deadly quest. This is not an exaggeration for the sake of a catchy phrase or cheap intrigue. Today, we spend a fortune on high-quality plumbing fixtures during renovations. We hire workers, select pipes, and install expensive filters. Ancient builders tackled these challenges with far harsher methods. They simply cut a hole in the floor and hope for the best.
And these primitive solutions cost thousands of people their health and lives.
Sounds strange, doesn't it? But let's think about the physics and basic sanitation of that time. The Roman Empire left behind magnificent aqueducts and sewer systems. However, after its fall, these ingenious technologies were safely forgotten. European cities plunged into an era of incredible filth and constant disease. Knights in shining armor looked good only on the pages of novels. Real historical figures lived in conditions of total and hopeless unsanitary conditions. Directors of historical films always tactfully gloss over the smell in castles, but the stench there was so bad that a modern person would have fainted. Human waste accumulated for decades right under the windows of noble lords. Many people think that ancient people simply got used to such filth. In reality, they fully understood the scale of this problem. They simply lacked the technology to adequately address it. They had to invent incredibly dubious methods of waste disposal. And each such invention spawned a chain of new, even more horrific disasters. Historians rarely classify toilet-related injuries as a separate category of mortality. It sounds too absurd for serious academic works and textbooks. However, indirect data points to a colossal number of victims of such structures. Diseases decimated entire settlements far more effectively than any enemy army. The center of the spread of infection was always the ordinary city outhouse.
Modern epidemiologists use computers to model medieval outbreaks of infection.
The results of these studies are literally hair-raising. It turns out that the layout of cities was ideal for the rapid spread of bacteria. Public toilets served as hubs in this invisible, deadly network. Bacteria traveled from person to person at an alarming rate. Think about your office job with its constant stress and deadlines. Your main problem is a frozen computer or a dissatisfied boss. For a medieval person, the biggest challenge was simply to survive another day without dysentery. This required ironclad health and incredible luck. Every visit to the so-called outhouse turned into a dangerous lottery. Imagine a typical stone outbuilding hanging over the fortress wall. At first glance, it's just a small, unassuming cubicle, but beneath it lay a veritable abyss of problems and repulsive parasites. It was there that massive epidemics took root, devastating entire countries. And the scariest part is that people built these breeding grounds of death voluntarily. Today, we'll take a detailed look at all the aspects of this grim historical phenomenon. We'll talk about gravity, ubiquitous insects, poisoned water, and military tactics. Yes, toilets sometimes became a key element in the siege of impregnable bastions. Get comfortable and prepare to dive into the dirtiest secret of history. I promise it will completely change your perception of the romantic Middle Ages. Castle engineers quickly realized one simple thing. Waste had to be removed from living quarters as quickly as possible. And the cheapest way to do this turned out to be plain old gravity. Builders simply placed toilet stalls outside the main walls. Waste fell straight down, guided by the laws of physics. This solution seems logical only at first glance. The problem was where exactly this waste landed. Most often, it fell straight into the defensive moat surrounding the castle. Over time, this moat turned into a giant, foul-smelling pit. No one even considered cleaning it out due to the exorbitant cost of the process. But things get more interesting when you look at urban architecture. In densely built-up cities, moats simply didn't exist. Toilet bay windows hung directly over narrow pedestrian streets and alleys. Passers-by risked getting an extremely unpleasant surprise right on their heads, and this happened with frightening regularity every single day. Modern people complain about pigeons that might ruin their coats. The residents of medieval Paris would have laughed at our modest problems. They had to dodge entire streams of human waste. That is precisely why wide-brimmed hats and voluminous cloaks came into use. It was not a fashion trend, but essential gear for survival. At night, the situation on the streets became even more dangerous and unpredictable.
City dwellers would empty their chamber pots out the windows, often without even looking down.
In some places, the law required them to shout a warning before throwing. However, the rules were rarely followed, and the shouts were lost in the city noise. A distracted passerby was guaranteed to get a stinking shower straight from the heavens. Today, the streets are cleaned by special machines and public works crews. Back then, this job was done by stray dogs and semi-wild city pigs. They roamed the alleys and ate everything that fell from above. It sounds incredibly disgusting, but it was the only sanitation system. Without these animals, the cities would have been buried in waste within a couple of weeks. The authorities periodically tried to ban this practice under threat of fines. Hundreds of court decrees have survived, threatening severe punishments for dumping garbage. But these bans were ignored with enviable historical consistency. People simply had no real alternative for waste disposal. There was no sewer system, and carting it away was too expensive. Imagine living on the ground floor in such a bustling neighborhood. All the waste from above inevitably piled up right outside your windows. Rain turned the streets into raging rivers of mud and feces. Pedestrians had to wear special wooden shoes with high platforms. Otherwise, it was absolutely impossible to walk through the city without getting knee-deep in filth.
Modern drainage systems use high-pressure water.
Medieval architects relied exclusively on the force of freefall. This engineering compromise made life unbearable for city dwellers for centuries. Gravity worked flawlessly, but not at all as the residents of the lower floors would have liked. Every building literally poisoned the lives of its immediate neighbors. As a result, cities grew, and the problem only scaled up and worsened. Waste seeped into basements, destroyed foundations, and contaminated the soil. What began as a simple gravitational solution turned into an urban planning disaster. Medieval engineers lost the battle against their own physiological needs, and hundreds of generations of ordinary townspeople had to pay the price. We always associate castles and palaces with grandeur and wealth. We imagine spacious halls, tapestries, and luxurious stone fireplaces. But the historical reality had a completely different, extremely specific smell. The problem lay in the internal design of those very gravity toilets. Their shafts ran along the walls, forming giant waste pipes. A modern exhaust fan costs a couple $100 and runs silently. A medieval lord had only natural drafts instead of a fan. The wind often blew in the wrong direction, carrying the odors back into the rooms. Ammonia and methane rose up the shafts straight into the royal bedchambers. No thick wooden doors could withstand this gaseous assault. In winter, the situation paradoxically only got worse and more unbearable. Castles were heated by fireplaces, which created a powerful draft inside the rooms. Warm air rose upward, drawing in the icy stench from the latrine shafts. Bedrooms filled with the aromas of cesspools at an incredible speed. The wealthy inhabitants literally suffocated in their luxurious stone chambers. Royal courts constantly moved from one castle to another. Many believe this was done for the sake of inspecting their estates or for entertainment. In reality, the reason was purely practical and quite mundane. They waited for the servants to clean out the overflowing cesspools at their previous residence.
Living in a castle for more than a few months became physically unbearable.
The servants tried to mask the odors with various fragrant herbs. The floors were strewn with fresh reeds, lavender, and various scented flowers. But this was like trying to put out a forest fire with a glass of water. The sweetish scent of the herbs mingled with the stench of sewage, creating a nauseating cocktail. Breathing in such rooms was a real ordeal for the lungs. Clothing also absorbed these scents like a giant sponge. Fabrics were rarely washed, as hot water and soap were expensive. Therefore, wealthy people used enormous amounts of perfumes and oils. They didn't just want to smell good to attract attention at balls. They were trying to mask the smell of their own homes and their neighbors' homes. The design of the toilets featured wooden seats with lids. In theory, these lids were supposed to block most of the unpleasant odors. In practice, the wood dried out, cracked, and became covered with a layer of bacteria. The lids never fit tightly against the stone bases of the toilets. The stench seeped through the cracks around the clock, without a break for lunch. In monasteries, the problem was even more acute due to the concentration of people. Monks built huge communal latrines over streams or rivers. But in the summer, the water often dried up, leaving mountains of waste in the heat. The stench was so bad that it became absolutely impossible to pray. Religion demanded humility, but not everyone could endure such a trial. Interestingly, doctors of that time considered foul odors to be the cause of all diseases. This concept was called the theory of miasms and prevailed for centuries. They sincerely believed that inhaling foul odors directly destroyed internal organs. And although they knew nothing of bacteria, in some ways these physicians were right.
Foul air did indeed linger in places where real death lurked.
Modern ventilation standards were developed over decades of work by engineers. We don't even notice how fresh air flows into our apartments. The ancient builders had not the slightest understanding of building aerodynamics. They built massive fortresses that could not protect their inhabitants from themselves. The smell was a constant, invisible enemy from which there was no escape. Open cesspools created yet another colossal problem for people. They served as the perfect incubator for millions of insects of all kinds. Common flies became the most terrifying biological threat of the time. They multiplied freely in the filth on an astronomical scale. No medieval castle could get rid of them. Today, we protect ourselves from insects with mosquito nets and foggers. We simply plug the device into an outlet and sleep peacefully all night. People in the Middle Ages had absolutely no protection against flying pests. Windows were closed only with rough wooden shutters that left gaps. Flies easily penetrated even the most secure royal chambers and kitchens. The medieval fly's route was short, but incredibly deadly. First, it spent time in the latrine shaft among rotting waste. Then it flew straight to the kitchen or the grand dining hall. There it safely landed on freshly baked bread or roasted meat. Bacteria were transferred to the food instantly and without a trace.
Gastrointestinal infections spread precisely according to this simple pattern.
People ate contaminated food and soon fell ill with severe food poisoning. Dysentery wiped out entire families in a matter of agonizing days. No one understood the connection between the tiny insect and the terrible disease. Flies were considered merely an annoying nuisance, not harbingers of imminent death. Doctors of that time continued to blame everything on poisonous miasmas and bad karma. They prescribed bloodletting for patients and applied leeches to their stomachs. Not a single physician suggested simply covering food with thick cloths. The real killers had wings and buzzed right above the patient's ears. Ignoring this threat cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent townspeople. The scale of insect reproduction was staggering even to their contemporaries. During the hot summer months, the latrines literally buzzed with the sheer number of larvae and flies. The open ditches around the cities turned into black, writhing carpets. Getting rid of them mechanically was an absolutely impossible task. Servants with fly swatters lost this war every single day. It is interesting to compare this with modern sanitary controls in food production. Today, the presence of a single fly can shut down a restaurant until the circumstances are clarified. In the Middle Ages, insects were an integral part of any meal. Soldiers on campaigns paid no attention at all to the critters in their cauldrons. The choice was simple: eat food with flies or starve to death. Young children suffered particularly from this biological terror. Their immune systems simply couldn't cope with such massive bacterial attacks. Infant mortality reached monstrous historical levels, and in many ways the cause was ordinary insects from the nearest outhouse. They claimed more lives than professional hired killers. Even the thickest fortress walls could not stop this tiny legion. Engineers built bastions against catapults and siege towers, but they proved completely defenseless against an army of ordinary, buzzing insects. A single fly flying in from the wardrobe could deprive an army of its experienced commander, and such absurd historical accidents occurred with frightening regularity. Evolution has endowed flies with a perfect mechanism for survival and reproduction in filth.
With their own hands, people created ideal greenhouse conditions for them, right inside their homes.
The lack of sewage systems became a golden age for these winged parasites. Humanity paid a huge price for its engineering ignorance, and this lesson was learned extremely slowly over many centuries. A separate, extremely rich ecosystem unfolded inside the toilet shafts. It was a veritable paradise for creatures that feed on human waste. Various intestinal parasites and their eggs found an ideal habitat there. They waited quietly for their next victim in the darkness and dampness of the stone walls. And this parasite exchange system ran like clockwork. Today, supermarkets offer us dozens of types of soft toilet paper. It is sterile, safe, and sold in convenient rolls at an affordable price. People in the Middle Ages could only dream of such a fantastic level of comfort. Instead of paper, they used moss, leaves, hay, or simply old rags. And it was precisely these hygiene products that became the main carriers of disease. Public and castle toilets often had a shared bundle of straw. Imagine the scale of the disaster when hundreds of people used the same material. Parasites instantly spread from a sick person to a perfectly healthy one. Helminth eggs remained on wooden seats in stone ledges. You could become infected simply by touching the surface inside the stall. Modern archaeologists are still finding evidence of the scale of this disaster. When excavating old cesspools, scientists take soil samples for analysis. The results show an astronomical concentration of eggs from various parasitic worms. Almost every person living at that time was a carrier of a veritable zoo inside their intestines. This was considered an absolute fact of life that people simply had to put up with. People's immune systems were working at the absolute limit of their capacity. The body constantly expended resources fighting internal invaders. Because of this, people often lacked the strength to resist common colds. Chronic fatigue and anemia were constant companions of medieval townspeople. Their health was being eroded daily from within, imperceptibly and relentlessly. Doctors attempted to treat these ailments with rather aggressive and gruesome methods. They prescribed patients toxic decoctions made from poisonous herbs and arsenic. The logic was simple. You had to poison the parasite before the patient died. Often, such medical experiments ended very sadly for the patient. The medicine turned out to be far more dangerous than the original problem. For the poor, the situation was exacerbated by constant malnutrition and poor quality water. Parasites consumed the lion's share of the meager calories they took in. A person could eat plenty of bread, but still kept losing weight and strength. This turned peasants into walking corpses, barely able to hold a hoe. Their productivity plummeted, leading to even greater food shortages. In wealthy households, the situation differed only in the quality of the food consumed. Lords ate plenty of meat, but they too used infested wardrobes. The lords' hunting dogs slept alongside their masters, adding fleas and ticks to the mix. The cycle of parasites in nature was unending and showed no regard for social status. Everyone suffered, from the lowliest beggar to the most powerful king. Modern anti-parasitic drugs solve this problem with a single pill. Pharmaceuticals have freed us from an ancient and invisible curse. Medieval people could only endure and hope for a miracle, but miracles did not happen, and parasites continued to reap their rich harvest. The toilet remained the main distribution center for this invisible army. This silent war raged alongside the boisterous nightly tournaments. While kings divided lands, worms divided the bodies of their subjects. A lack of basic knowledge about sanitation left people completely defenseless targets. Primitive outhouses ensured that this biological threat would never disappear. Humanity survived not because of technology, but rather in spite of it. Urban planning in the Middle Ages resembled a game of Russian roulette. Cesspools were constantly dug right in the courtyards of residential houses and taverns. And literally just a few meters away, workers were digging wells for drinking water. No one gave any thought to how groundwater moved underground. This ignorance led to catastrophic consequences for the entire population. Liquid waste from toilets seeped through the porous city soil for years. The toxic sludge inevitably reached the aquifers and mixed with them. People drew water from wells, sincerely believing it to be crystal clear. To the eye, it might indeed have seemed completely transparent and safe, but the chemical and bacteriological composition of this liquid was simply deadly. That is precisely why in medieval Europe, people tried not to drink raw water at all. Everyone, young and old, preferred to drink weak ale or diluted wine. The fermentation process and the presence of alcohol at least partially killed dangerous bacteria. Even small children drank beer for breakfast instead of the milk we're used to. This wasn't a tendency toward alcoholism, but a basic survival strategy. Modern filtration systems purify water through several complex stages. We drink tap water and aren't the least bit afraid of contracting cholera. In those days, clean drinking water was an unaffordable luxury for the few. Forest springs were far away, and transporting water from there was difficult. City dwellers had to make do with the contaminated water right at their feet. Rivers flowing through major cities also turned into open sewers. Butchers dumped bones into them, tanners discharged toxic chemicals, and people disposed of their waste. Yet people often drew water from these very rivers for washing and cooking. Pollution reached such levels that the water literally changed color. The Thames in London became a symbol of the environmental catastrophe of that grim era. Outbreaks of cholera and typhoid fever were a direct consequence of the lack of proper infrastructure. Bacteria entered the body through a glass of water and began their destructive work. The disease spread like wildfire, wiping out entire neighborhoods in a matter of weeks. For a long time, doctors could not understand why people were dying so suddenly and in such large numbers. They looked for causes in the stars instead of checking the nearby well. It wasn't until the 19th century that scientists proved the link between water and epidemics. Until then, millions of people regularly met their end due to ignorance. It was, in essence, a massive experiment in the natural selection of humanity. Those who survived were the ones whose immune systems could handle the daily dose of dissolved sewage. Toilets dug without regard for hydrology were silent serial killers. They operated around the clock, poisoning the most vital resource for life. Water, which was supposed to give life, brought only suffering and death. Overcrowding in medieval cities gave rise to the phenomenon of public toilets. These were huge wooden or stone structures with dozens of stalls. The design usually did not include any partitions between the holes in the floor. People sat shoulder to shoulder, discussing the latest city news and gossip. Privacy was considered a luxury, and a trip to the restroom was a collective social event. Modern public restrooms are cleaned using strong, chlorine-based products. They have exhaust fans, touchless faucets, and automatic flushing systems. The medieval equivalent was a massive open pit teeming with bacteria. People came there with dirty hands and left with even dirtier ones. It was the perfect distribution center for every known infection. These places became especially dangerous during major city fairs. Thousands of merchants, peasants, and vagrants from all over the region flocked to the city. The load on public latrines increased tenfold, or even 100-fold. Waste couldn't be flushed away through the sewers fast enough and piled up right underfoot. Fairs often ended not only with profits, but also with mass funerals. City authorities periodically attempted to clean out these gigantic cesspools. This work was carried out by specialized workers known as night gold diggers. The profession was so horrific that workers were paid enormous sums by the standards of the time. They worked only at night so as not to shock the townspeople with the sight and smell. Many of them died from suffocation by toxic gases right at their workplace. Interestingly, modern epidemiologists consider such places to be super spreaders. In virology theory, there is the concept of high-density contact nodes. Medieval communal toilets fit this modern scientific definition perfectly. It was from there that the plague and cholera began their triumphant march through the neighborhoods. It was free transportation for any epidemic to any part of the city. It sounds crazy, but some public toilets were built right on bridges. The idea seemed brilliant. The river itself would carry all the waste far beyond the city limits. In practice, this meant that all the filth floated downstream to the neighbors. If an epidemic broke out upstream, the lower part of the city would be infected within a couple of days. Rivers turned into conveyor belts for delivering biological waste. For the poor, public toilets were the only accessible place to relieve themselves. There simply wasn't room in their tiny shacks to set up private chamber pots. The poor became the first and most numerous victims of unsanitary conditions. Wealthy lords could afford to fall ill in the comfort of their own isolated castles. Social inequality was starkly evident even in the methods of disposing of human waste. The experience of past centuries has clearly shown what overcrowding in unsanitary conditions leads to. The public toilets of the past were not a blessing, but veritable time bombs, and they exploded with frightening regularity, claiming the lives of entire generations. But bacteria and odors were far from the only problem with medieval toilets. There was also a purely mechanical, physical danger that is rarely mentioned in books. The surfaces inside the stalls and along the walkways leading to them were constantly slippery. Moisture, dirt, and filth turned the wooden planks into a veritable ice rink. A single misstep could lead to catastrophic and fatal consequences. Imagine a classic wardrobe hanging over an abyss in a castle. To use it, you had to approach the edge of a deep, dark opening. The wooden seats often rotted from constant dampness and temperature fluctuations. The planks could collapse under the weight of an adult in knightly armor, and such absurd accidents occurred much more frequently than is commonly believed. Falling into the latrine shaft meant more than just soiled clothes. A person would plummet several dozen meters down, striking the stone ledges of the walls. At the bottom, instead of a soft mattress, a deep reservoir of years' worth of waste awaited them. Escaping from there on one's own while wearing heavy clothing was an absolutely impossible task. The victim would either be crushed to death or slowly drown in the incredibly toxic sludge. Modern builders strictly regulate the slope angles of bathroom floors. We have non-slip mats, matte tiles, and convenient handrails. The ancient lords didn't even have primitive lamps for nighttime trips to the toilet. Going to the bathroom at night with a candle was an extremely dangerous and risky idea. Methane accumulating in the shaft could easily explode from an open flame. The darkness and slippery floor made nighttime visits a true test of agility. The elderly and children were in a group of particular maximum risk. They often stumbled in the dark and fell into that foul-smelling abyss. Chronicles contain records of noblemen who perished in such an inglorious and gruesome manner. To die not on the battlefield, but in one's own toilet was a terrible disgrace for a knight. In winter, the danger of falling was compounded by the threat of severe frostbite. The toilet stalls were unheated and blown through by icy winds. The frozen wooden planks became incredibly hard and smooth, like real glass. A simple trip to the coat check required acrobatic skills and extreme concentration. There was not the slightest chance of relaxing in such a place. This aspect of medieval life perfectly illustrates the level of everyday stress people faced. The home was no fortress in terms of basic domestic comfort and safety. Danger lurked in the most unexpected and seemingly harmless places. Toilets claimed lives with cold, indifferent persistence for centuries. They were silent killers, knowing neither mercy nor nobility. Medieval military tactics were not limited to just beautiful, knightly charges on horseback. The siege of a well-fortified castle could last for months or even years. Commanders sought out any and all unconventional ways to penetrate the impregnable stone walls. And here, gravity-fed toilets unexpectedly served as the perfect architectural weak link. They turned out to be magnificent secret passages for the most desperate saboteurs. The thickness of a castle's stone walls could reach several meters of solid masonry. Breaking through them with a battering ram was extremely difficult, time-consuming, and incredibly expensive. But the toilet shaft was a ready-made vertical pipe leading straight into the rooms. Yes, it was filled with sewage, but for desperate soldiers, that was no obstacle. The desire to win drove the warriors to commit acts that were utterly insane from the standpoint of hygiene. The infiltration plan was frighteningly simple, but it required incredible physical endurance. Under cover of night, a group of lightly armed scouts descended into the foul-smelling defensive moat. They found the shaft opening and began climbing up the slippery stone walls. The stench inside could kill an unprepared person in just a few long minutes. But those who survived found themselves right inside a well-fortified citadel. The famous siege of Chateau Gaillard by the French king Philip II is a textbook example. The English considered this fortress of Richard the Lionheart to be an absolutely impregnable stronghold. However, French soldiers found the entrance to an old latrine shaft and crawled inside. They opened the gates from within, deciding the outcome of a months-long, grueling siege. The pride of English engineering fell because of a simple outhouse. For the castle's defenders, such attacks always came as a complete and shocking surprise. They expected an assault on the main gates or a tunnel dug under the corner towers. Later, the architects realized their fatal mistake and began modifying the shafts. They started making the openings narrower and designing the shafts with sharp angles. Iron grates were installed to block the path of any daring infiltrators. However, these grates quickly became clogged with waste, creating terrible blockages and new problems. Engineers constantly had to choose between safety and basic hygiene. This historical fact proves that there is no room for excessive squeamishness in war. Victory goes not to the one who is better dressed, but to the one who is ready for anything. The soldiers who crawled to the sewage have forever etched their names into the textbooks of tactics. Their feat sounds disgusting, but its effectiveness is undeniable. Sometimes the path to a great victory literally lies through the filthiest places. Castles took decades to build, yet were captured in a single, stinking night. Latrine shafts turned out to be the Achilles heel of all medieval fortification science, and this lesson cost the lords dearly. Infiltration was not the only problem with latrines during long sieges. The situation became far more dire when the enemy simply encircled the castle tightly. A siege forced hundreds of people to hide inside a confined space for many months, and at that point, the familiar system of gravity-fed waste disposal ceased to function normally. A veritable biological catastrophe began, destroying the defenders from within. Normally, waste fell into a moat, which was at least minimally eroded by rain. But when the castle was surrounded, the moat was often filled in or its drainage blocked. Sewage began to accumulate rapidly right at the base of the defensive stone walls. The mountain of waste grew with each day of the siege, sometimes reaching enormous proportions. Soon it blocked the shaft openings themselves, preventing waste from falling down. The sewage system backed up, filling the latrines to the brim with toxic sludge. Living in the castle became physically impossible due to the concentrated ammonia smog. People's eyes watered. They began to have trouble breathing and suffered from severe migraines. The overcrowding of troops and peasants reduced sanitary conditions to utter absurdity. The defenders were literally stewing in the juices of their own bodily fluids. The attacking army understood this mechanism perfectly and actively exploited it. Enemy commanders often didn't even attempt to storm the thick walls. They knew that time was on their side, turning the castle into a gas chamber. All they had to do was wait for unsanitary conditions to do all the dirty work. And this cruel calculation proved correct in the vast majority of historical cases. In a confined space, epidemics of dysentery and typhus broke out in a matter of days. If a single person fell ill, the infection spread instantly to the entire garrison of the fortress. Doctors could not isolate the sick, as there simply wasn't enough space. There were no medicines, and clean water ran out as early as the second month of the siege. The castle turned into a giant, well-fortified hospital for the terminally ill. Sometimes the besiegers sped up the process using primitive but effective biological weapons. They hurled rotting animal carcasses or barrels of feces over the walls with catapults. This instantly contaminated the inner wells and greatly increased the risk of disease. For the defenders, it was a death sentence with no chance of appeal. Surrendering to the enemy often seemed the better option than dying from widespread infection. Hunger and disease claimed more soldiers' lives than arrows or swords. Historians have calculated that combat casualties accounted for only a small fraction of total deaths. A knight's main enemy was not another knight, but a tiny intestinal bacterium. Proud warriors died in agony, unable to cross swords with an enemy. It was an utterly inglorious, yet incredibly common, death. Engineering errors in the design of toilets cost the Richards and Phillips dearly. They built fortresses to defend against external, visible, armed enemies. But they completely failed to consider protection against an internal, invisible, and foul-smelling enemy. Castles became deadly traps for their own rightful owners. And this irony of fate vividly characterizes the entire contradiction of the gloomy Middle Ages. History is often taught to us as a series of great battles and noble alliances. We marvel at Gothic cathedrals and mighty castles while reading encyclopedias. But beneath this glossy historical veneer lies an extremely grim reality of everyday life. Every day, medieval people waged an invisible war for their own basic survival. And the front line in this war often ran right through their homes. The lack of basic engineering and understanding of sanitation cost humanity millions of lives. Gravity toilets now seem to us like a ridiculous and barbaric historical absurdity. But for the people of that time, it was a cruel, inescapable, and foul-smelling reality. They paid a huge price for every day of life in the great European cities. Diseases, odors, and parasites were their constant, invisible neighbors. Modern plumbing is one of the greatest achievements of our civilization. We take clean water and a functioning sewer system for granted. But in reality, it is a luxury that has come to us through centuries of suffering. Countless nameless generations of ancestors paid with their lives for every flush of the toilet. It is worth remembering this the next time you pay your utility bills. The historical paradox is that progress does not always move in a straight line. The Romans knew how to build aqueducts, but their knowledge was lost for a millennium. Europeans had to relearn, through pain and mistakes, the basics of urban sanitation. This proves that technological achievements are incredibly fragile in the face of ignorance. The loss of knowledge can easily throw civilization back into the mud, literally. Now you know the true cost of chivalric romance in life in castles. The next time you watch a beautiful historical film, Remember these facts. Imagine the smell, the swarm of flies, and the slippery wooden planks over a deep chasm. History was not only great, but also incredibly dangerous in terms of everyday life. And the scariest place in it was sometimes just behind the most ordinary door.